Hi, Barely Sapient here. Today we're going to take a look at Fedora and Linux Mint. Specifically, Fedora 43 and Linux Mint 22.3, which just came out. We're going to take a look at gaming performance and what software is available and how stable both operating systems are. While gaming, neither distro crashed at all, so that's great. For Fedora, there are three main versions and lots of spins, including atomic desktops. I just tested the KDE Plasma Edition. Now, out of the main ones, there's the server, there's the Plasma Edition, and Workstation. Workstation uses GNOME. The KDE Plasma Edition uses KDE Plasma, of course, for the desktop environment, and the server just doesn't come with a desktop environment. For Linux Mint, I use the Cinnamon Edition. You can also, their main editions, you can also get the XFCE edition, which is very lightweight and uses less system resources, as well as the Mate edition, which is their old classic desktop environment, and it's based off of GNOME. When you first install Fedora, it's going to show you a welcome screen or set of screens, and it's going to tell you basically some features of it and stuff like that, and whether or not you want to send anonymous usage data. Now, one of the things that'll pop up is to label third-party repositories. This is a convenient thing. Yes, you want to do that. This will allow you to download things like Steam, as an example. Linux Mint also has a welcome screen thing, and it has something called First Steps. This is where you can set up like how you want your desktop to look like and stuff like that, and it also shows you a system snapshot program known as Timeshift. This is actually really good for backing up your system, and to a point where, let's say if you're going to, let's say if you install something and it breaks your system somehow, with this you can revert back to a snapshot. It's really useful that way. And then the next thing that's probably most important when you're first installing it is the driver manager. If you have an Nvidia card like this system does, for instance, you're going to want to use this. This will find any drivers that your system needs that are proprietary. Which is, as you can see, I've already installed drivers for this Nvidia card, but it'll give you a list of drivers available for it. It's really handy. You just click on which one you want, and then you can hit apply changes, and it will install it for you. On a clean boot, Fedora on this system used about 2.4 to 2.5 gigabytes of memory. And Linux Mint on this hardware used on a clean boot about 1.7 gigabytes of memory, so a lot less than Fedora. Both distros are considered general usage distributions, and both do come with LibreOffice right out of the box once you install. Fedora with the KDE comes with the Discover application manager or installer or package manager, whatever you want to call it, or storefront. Discover mixes both Flatpak and Fedora distribution packages for you to install as software, and various different types of software available. You have education, things for graphics, you have more office stuff if you want that. You have system utility. For Linux Mint, it has the software manager, which is its storefront or package manager, whatever you want to call it. And it also has Flatpaks and Linux Mint packages to install as software for your various needs, including but not limited to internet and graphics and games, of course, and office tools. The other thing is Linux Mint comes standard with LibreOffice as well. So in Fedora, discover the package manager, you can only install the Flatpak version of Steam, and it's usually better in most cases to install the version of Steam tailored for your distribution. That's not a problem. All you have to do is open up your terminal, which is called console, if you're using KDE Plasma, and you're going to open that up, type sudo space dnf space install space Steam. And then it's going to ask you for your password. And of course, line gives me the message that it's already installed because I've already done this. But that is how you install the Fedora version of Steam in Fedora. In Fedora, both Proton Plus and Heroic Games Launcher can be installed from Discover. In Linux Mint, you can install the system package for Steam. And of course, Heroic Games Launcher and Proton Plus, which are both flat packs anyway. To install Nvidia drivers in Fedora 43, you do have to use the command line. So you're going to open up your console and you're going to type sudo space dnf space install space akmod -nvidia. Hit enter and follow the prompts. Of course, it will ask you for your password. And as you can see, I've already done this, so it's already installed on my system. In Fedora, the latest driver version for the Nvidia Quadro M4000 is 580.119.02. For the Nvidia M4000 in Linux Mint, the latest driver is 580.95.05. Linux Mint, sometime during the install process, will just ask you if you want to install multimedia codecs, and all you have to do is click the checkbox, and you're good to go on that one. Out of the box, Fedora does not support a lot of video codecs, so you do have to install them yourself. This took some time, but I found a really easy way to do it using a terminal. That's the only way to do it. I found these on GitHub, and I will leave a link in the description. Basically, you're going to copy and paste these command line instructions from GitHub, and this will get you all good to go on video codecs for video playback. With that first instruction, you're going to put a sudo in front of it, otherwise it won't do it. And then you're going to copy and paste DNF remove GTstreamer plugin -open H64. And then for this next one, you're going to copy this whole mess here. That's all highlighted in gray. You're going to copy that. That's also going to be with sudo. You're adding the RPM Fusion repositories. Once it's done doing its thing, you're going to go on to the next instruction, which is sudo dnf swap ffmpeg -free ffmpeg - allow raising. After that, you're going to use the next line. Now, the line after that, only if you have Intel. And it was funny because with Fedora, when I was installing it, it didn't ask, and I didn't think anything of it. And then I went to go record some gameplay, and I couldn't watch the video from recording. And that's what prompted me to figure out how to do that. By the way, GPU Screen Recorder is a great little program that's available on both Linux Mint and Fedora. And it uses your GPU to record gameplay. You can record your screen, that sort of thing. It uses a minimal amount of system resources to do it. It's pretty performant. It's good stuff. So out of the box, Linux Mint is easier to set up for gaming and for multimedia than Fedora is. Both come with LibreOffice, so they're about equal that way. But what about gaming performance? Fedora uses Wayland while Linux Mint uses X11, so my first guess would be that Fedora is going to be faster, but we'll see. To test both distros, I used my AMD Ryzen 1600 AF system with 32 gigabytes of DDR4 memory at 2933 megahertz with an Nvidia Quadro M4000 as the GPU, as well as a 512 gigabyte SSD and various other disks for support. First up is Batman Arkham Asylum. These great games, Nvidia sponsored titles from the late 2000s, early 2010s, really take advantage of Nvidia physics, and they're fun to play to this day. Great games. Anyway, on both distros, this game was smooth and easy to play and responsive. Wouldn't be able to tell the difference in performance without actually taking a look at the numbers. And Fedora 43, it averaged 61.4 frames per second, had a 1% low of 46.9 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 12.9 frames per second. Whilst in Linux Mint, it had an average of 59.8 frames per second, a 1% low of 41.6 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 17 frames per second. But then again, I couldn't tell without taking a look at the numbers which one performed better. Will they run Crysis? And the answer is yes, but one is much better than the other. Linux Mint kind of struggled at times at 1080p, and this is the highest settings with no anti-aliasing. But there were times when you could feel it slowing down. It would stop or stutter, and you can see that in the frame graph. It and Linux Mint averaged 45.5 frames per second, and had a 1% low of 11.5 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 5.6 frames per second, so that explains the slowdown. In Fedora, gameplay in Crysis was actually a lot better. Didn't see the same stutters and slowdowns. It averaged 57.9 frames per second, had a 1% low of 27.4 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 11.3 frames per second. But you can see the difference in the frame graph, and it's a much better experience on Fedora. Next up is Counter-Strike 2, and I set the settings to low at 1080p with dynamic shadows turned to all for a competitive advantage. In Linux Mint, after playing a few matches and trying to let the system settle into playing this game, it never quite got there. There would be slowdowns, and gameplay would at times become unplayable, unfortunately. At these settings, it averaged 59.8 frames per second, had a 1% low of 24.7 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 16.2 frames per second. It's those times that would, sometimes just slow down that would make it unplayable, in my opinion. It was a much different story in Fedora 43. Gameplay was definitely, this is definitely playable. It's not ideal. It's still below 100 frames per second, so I wouldn't try to compete with this much, but it's certainly playable. So it averaged 74.8 frames per second, had a 1% low of 42.9 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 25.2 frames per second. So it actually did a lot better than Linux Mint on this one. Next up is Grand Theft Auto Enhanced at 1080p high settings. Both distros performed really pretty much remarkably the same. In Fedora, Grand Theft Auto 5 Enhanced averaged 37.6 frames per second, had a 1% low of 23.7 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 15.1 frames per second. In Linux Mint, the average was slightly higher at 38.1 frames per second, and a 1% low of 22.2 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 19.2 frames per second. If I didn't look at the numbers, wouldn't be able to tell they're different at all. So in both distros, Grand Theft Auto 5 Enhanced is a console-like but playable experience. Next up is Nier Automata, and this is at 1080p high with anti-aliasing turned off. Now in Fedora, it was smooth and responsive and stable. It averaged 39.2 frames per second, had a 1% low of 29.8 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 15.4 frames per second. Now, in Linux Mint, it wasn't quite as stable. Every once in a while in Mint, you'd experience kind of a slowdown a little bit. Not noticeable most of the time, but every once in a while, you'd notice the difference. And it averaged 37.9 frames per second, had a 1% low of 24.5 frames per second. And I think it's these 0.1% lows because this was only at 9.5 frames per second on Linux Mint. Next up is Rocket League, and I tested at 900p to make sure it would stay above 100 frames per second. And it did in both operating systems. And it was definitely responsive, easy to play, no stutters, drops, nothing like that. Either distro. So both averaged again above 120 frames per second actually. And Fedora at 900p high settings. Rocket League averaged 139.3 frames per second, had a 1% low of 58.9 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 51.3 frames per second. Now in Linux Mint it actually did quite a lot better, as it did 165 frames per second, had a 1% low of 82.9 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 71.3 frames per second. So Linux Mint actually won big here. Next up is Skyrim Special Edition, and in Fedora, it performed as expected, as it averaged 57.2 frames per second, had a 1% low of 48.8 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 27.3 frames per second. And gameplay was smooth and responsive, and I didn't notice any slowdowns. In Linux Mint, Skyrim Special Edition didn't feel quite as smooth. It had a higher average, but lower 1 and 0.1% lows. It averaged 61.1 frames per second, had a 1% low of 28.1 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 19 frames per second. And I could feel it when I was playing. It just wasn't as smooth. Next up is Stray, and I tested at 1080p medium settings with textures set to high. And in both distros, it was smooth, responsive, and playable. However, the numbers are interesting. In Fedora, the average was 68.4 frames per second, the 1% low of 46.4 frames per second, and had a 0.1% low of 28.7 frames per second. And in Linux Mint, it actually had a much higher average at 86.1 frames per second, had a 1% low, which was lower at 39.9 frames per second, and a 0.1% that was also lower at 24.6 frames per second. In both distros, it was definitely playable, and I didn't really notice any slowdowns, and it was smooth and responsive, but the numbers are interesting nonetheless. So at the end of the day, after looking at the numbers and reviewing the gameplay, remembering which games felt smooth and which didn't, I'd have to say Fedora is the better gaming distro out of the box. Sure, Linux Mint did win on average frames per second on two games. That would be Stray and Rocket League. But in both instances, the games played functionally the same when I was playing them at the settings tested. And there were a number of games where Fedora just outperformed Linux Mint, and where the gameplay was actually stable and playable, and where it wasn't in Mint. So yeah, I'm gonna have to give the gaming win to Fedora on this one. While gaming, I had no crashes or hardware freezes of any kind in either distro. Stability was perfect. However, a GPU screen recorder on Fedora crashed a couple of times. There's also a couple of times after gaming for a while I'd have to shut down and restart Steam in Fedora in order for it to launch games again. So not quite as stable as Linux Mint, as I had no problems whatsoever in Linux Mint. Okay, so other than a couple of times the GPU screen recorder crashed and having to restart Steam in Fedora, I didn't have any problems with it. So when it comes down to it, when I compare both operating systems, and Fedora is definitely the better gaming system. It's a little harder to set up than Linux Mint, so ease of use, Linux Mint wins. As far as stability, well, I didn't experience any issues in Linux Mint. Well, I did experience a couple in Fedora, so I suppose Linux Mint has to win on stability as well. Now, keep in mind, both distros did perfectly fine and had no problems whatsoever while gaming. But if you are gaming, Fedora is faster. So on older Nvidia hardware like this Quadro M4000, Fedora 43 is going to give you a better gaming experience than Linux Mint. But it might possibly be a little bit less stable when you're doing other things. Anyways, I hope you liked the video, and I'll catch you in the next one. Like and subscribe if you like the video, and comments are always welcome.